Saratoga. It began September 1777. A cast of legendary characters took the field that autumn. General Horatio Gates led a mixed force of Continental soldiers and militia. Among the American officers who would fight bravely and well at Saratoga was General Benedict Arnold. But perhaps the most interesting of all these figures was General Jon Burgoyne, who commanded the British Army of over 7,000, pushing southward toward Saratoga. The Baroness von Riedesel, wife of a German officer who fought for the British at Saratoga, was less than impressed with Burgoyne. The general, she wrote, is very fond of indulging. He spent half the nights in singing and drinking and amusing himself with the wife of the commissary, who was his mistress, and who, as well as he, loved champagne. The general was also a gambling man. He had placed his army in a position that eliminated any chance of retreat back to Canada. He would have to conquer or face humiliating defeat. He took the risk and he lost. After suffering staggering losses and finding the enemy to be on all sides of him, General Johnny surrendered his army to Horatio Gates. Benedict Arnold, a hero of Saratoga, did not gain the credit he felt he deserved and would later betray the revolutionary cause and sell himself to the British. He became synonymous in the American language for traitor. Horatio Gates, the victor of Saratoga, later suffered military defeat in the South that discredited him. And Burgoyne returned to England, where he devoted himself to literary pursuits and the London stage. Saratoga, in the autumn of 1777, was not only a turning point for many of its characters, but also an even greater turning point for the war. Saratoga was the first major military victory over a regular British army. The world began to take America seriously. What had begun as a rebellion now became an international war. France became an ally. Spain and Holland would later enter the war, and America fought no longer alone. Yet the war was far from over. Unlike Gates, Washington had suffered a series of losses that autumn and had taken his army into winter quarters in a place called Valley Forge. In the spring of 1778, things didn't look that much better. Food and clothing for Washington's army were still scarce. But if you step back and look at the war with a large lens, you can see there was a renewed hope. Now the focus of the war would shift to the South, where the British and Americans would campaign for the next 3 years. Campaigns that would eventually lead to a victory here at Yorktown. For some time, the Americans had an ally in the Marquis de Lafayette, the youthful, dashing Frenchman who had nimbly evaded the might of the British commander, Lord Cornwallis. But somewhere over there was the French fleet, and Washington fully understood what Allied sea power might accomplish. Cornwallis fortified his army on the York Peninsula to face Lafayette's force, keeping his back to the sea. If Washington could bring his American-French army down from New York to trap Cornwallis by land, and Admiral de Grasse could bring his French fleet to do the same by sea, Cornwallis was doomed. In late August, the French fleet appeared off Yorktown. Then the French and American troops arrived, and now an Allied army of 17,000 laid siege to Cornwallis's fortifications. On October 19, 1781, while the troops looked on and the band played "The World Turned Upside Down," Lord Charles Cornwallis and more than 7,000 of His Majesty's soldiers laid down their arms and surrendered. Yorktown had been a bitter battle, and there was fighting yet to come, but the war was essentially over. Who could have believed 7 years earlier that such an outcome was possible? I talked with Professor Maslovsky. What were the real turning points in the Revolutionary War?
I think we had two really critical turning points. First of all, there'd be the Battle of Saratoga. And the importance of Saratoga is that it unbalances the scales of military weakness in favor of the Americans. And it does this by converting what had been a colonial rebellion into an international war. And once France enters the war, and you see it's Saratoga that convinces the French that the Americans can win, and so consequently France and the United States sign a Treaty of Alliance in February of 1778. And then the second great turning point, and one which I think is well known, is the Battle of Yorktown. And the Battle of Yorktown, I think you could say, is very much a direct result of Saratoga and the French alliance. Now, at the siege of Cornwallis in Yorktown, you had about 8,900 American soldiers, but more significantly, I think you have to keep in mind you had a French fleet and no American fleet. You had French engineers who supervised the digging of the siege lines. You had French artillery, and you had 7,800 Frenchmen. And of course, the surrender of Cornwallis at Yorktown really doesn't lead to a military defeat of the British in North America. What it does is it breaks the will of Parliament to continue the struggle in North America.
What factors ultimately led to the American victory?
One factor, Ryland, was certainly the French alliance. I have a very hard time imagining the Americans achieving independence if they hadn't had support from the French. On the other hand, I think it's important not to underestimate American generalship, particularly George Washington, and American fighting forces. Washington became a very good general. He made some terrible mistakes trying to defend New York City, but essentially he learned from that campaign. And in essence, what he decided to do was to win the war by not losing the Continental Army. He came to the correct understanding, I think it was a correct understanding, that the Continental Army was the heart, the soul, and the backbone of the American Revolution, that as long as you had the Continental Army, the revolutionary cause was going to live. And so he adopted a strategy of the strategic defensive, which I think was ideally suited to further American interests. The idea was he would only rarely give battle, and meanwhile he would simply wait for the British to become frustrated and war-weary. In regard to American fighting forces, the Revolution sees us develop what might be called a dual army tradition. And the dual army tradition consists of a regular professional army that gives you military expertise, and you combine that with a mass citizen soldier reserve known as the militia that can give you large numbers of troops on very short notice. Now, in regard to the Continental Army, which was the regular professional army called out by Congress, commanded by George Washington, it was always small, but it became a very good fighting force. I think it was as effective as British regulars by, say, 1778. The militia, called out in brief periods, reinforced the Continental Army at practically every single critical engagement of the war. And another factor that I think is extremely important in American success was that, like most successful revolutionaries, the Americans were truly great at improvisation. Look, they started from scratch. They started with nothing. And they establish a government, they raise armed forces, both in Army and Navy, and they conduct such astute diplomacy that they get not only the incredibly favorable French alliance, but also an equally incredibly favorable peace treaty at the end of the war.